Hello, everyone, and welcome to the New Earth Lawyer podcast, where we feature conversations with lawyers who are changing the practice of law to change the world. I'm Geraldine Johns-Putra. I'm your host. I'm a lawyer myself, and I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. Today, my guest is John Chisholm. John is a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. He is a third-generation recovering lawyer who founded John Chisholm Consulting in 2005. But before that, he was a partner, a managing partner, and chief executive of two leading Australian law firms for more than 20 years. Now, John was also my principal when I was an articled clerk. So literally, without this man, I would not be a lawyer today. But the firms that John led, they were transformed into market leaders in their fields. When he stopped practicing law, John began to share his expertise with the wider profession. And what he has focused on is helping professionals move beyond the traditional law firm model, the one that uses the billable hour to charge clients and measure performance. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Geraldine, and thank you so much for inviting me. God, yes, you were my article clerk, probably my last article clerk, but you've been successful in spite of that, in spite of me being your principal. So, well, it's great to catch up again.
Thank you. If I wasn't the last, I was close to the last, because I know that very soon after that, you went on, you became managing partner of another firm, the firm I was at, and then another firm.
Yep.
And then you struck out as a consultant. So what a journey. Can you tell us what motivated you to do that?
Oh, look, I'd like to think that after, yes, I think I was managing partner for 8 or 9 years at Maddocks, or Maddocks Laney and Chisholm as it then was, because, as you know, nepotism was still acceptable in the legal profession back in those days. And I left Maddocks the end of 1999 and went to another firm that was then called Middleton's Moore and Bevans, that since then has morphed into K&L Gates, and I was chief executive there for 4 years, I think. And then, I think I was burnt out, and I suspect the profession or the law firm was burnt out with me. In 2005, my wife Karen and I took off and literally drove around Australia for 5 months, I think, Geraldine, until I think my accountant and bank manager sort of tried to convince me I should come back. But just to answer your question, I didn't do that, or I didn't have any, at least in those days, amazing purpose that I was going to reinvent myself as a consultant back to the profession. And in fact, if I'm honest, the last thing I wanted to do was have anything to do with lawyers again. But, I did think I had to think of what I was going to do with the next stage of my life. I turned 50 then. And I think, to be frank, I fell into the consulting. I was lucky enough, I had a couple of friends or managing partners of other firms that sort of said, "Oh, John, before you go to move on to your next firm or whatever you're going to do, something about management or the legal profession. Can you give us a hand with a couple of projects?" And so I guess one thing led on to another. I then sort of worked out that maybe I could, at least for some time, scratch a bit of a living out of this. I did enjoy it. It was a mindset change for me, actually being in the firm or being in firms, but then as a consultant, to sort of distance yourself and going, well, it's not my firm, so also don't take things on board. So that was hard. I'm not trying to say it was all care, no responsibility, because I do care about my clients very much. But
it's different when you're the outsider, and also because when you're talking about partnerships, there's a certain culture that grows up between partners. I mean, I know because I was a partner as well at the firm that I left last year. And it is, once you have established that relationship between people, for better or for worse, having someone else come in from the outside to tell you what to do or to fix your problem can be a little bit of a challenge. So rather than be the insider, you found yourself doing the opposite.
Yeah, and I think I found, look, I guess anyone can find a problem. It's then how do you get to some of the solutions, and they're not easy, and most of them are quite complex. And you've mentioned the partnership structure. I have to say most of them have got to do with that sort of structure and personalities and behaviours. So it's usually not one simple solution or even a cause of things. It's to do with we're people's profession, and a lot of it is to do with the people, I have to say. In fact, I'd say 90% of it is.
It all comes down to the people, whether it's dealing with clients or your other partners. I always used to think that being at partner meetings was like being at a big family reunion, where you kind of know what everybody's personality is and how everybody's going to react, and where the fights are going to be, or where the issues are going to arise. Not that there were a lot of fights, but the relationships really come to the fore.
And I think sometimes, I mean, it's certainly a role as a managing partner and CEO, at times you tried not to be compromised, but you did have to use influencing skills as much as anything else to the fore. And, I still do. I mean, my why, my purpose is to, influence motivated professionals to make a difference. And I realised that I can't actually change anyone's minds. I can't go, change the behaviours. I needed to work with people who perhaps were already motivated, people who, just wanted some help with the change. And the best I could do was influence them. As a consultant, I usually, whilst I may say I work with firms, it's usually individuals. It's usually, an internal champion that you latch onto, and, hopefully that internal champion themselves has influence within the firm, because I quickly realised in the consulting profession that if there wasn't an internal champion or champions, very little was going to change in sustainable and genuine change.
And then you went from having this opportunity to make a difference at a couple of law firms through your network, to becoming the, shall I say, poster boy for new pricing models. I remember that in the early 2000s or mid 2000s.
I became the target, the pin-up target, not the pin-up poster boy, let me tell you, Geraldine. Yeah, and look, that was just something, again, I was shy filling out timesheets when I was a lawyer, and as managing partner and CEO, I didn't have to fill out timesheets. I could just make everyone else in the firm fill out timesheets. But I guess, and I didn't think deeply enough in it when I did hate, particularly as a CEO, occasionally where, you had a client who wouldn't pay the bill or was suffering bill shock or whatever, and on the one hand, and then you had a partner who, say, oh, look, I did the time, blah, 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 and that caused, I hated those discussions if I was involved in them. Invariably, there was a compromise or but trust took a hit too with clients, and you can understand it, perhaps back in those days we didn't even give estimates, but if I tell you, ballpark, it's going to be around $20,000 and I finish billing you $60,000 or $70,000 or $80,000, well, there's often a bit of explaining to do. So I didn't like that side of things, I'd say, and also perhaps internally it had the effect of the billable hour, I think, and it still does, regrettably, of a production mentality.
Extraction, I think, rather than generation.
And look, I just think, and I say this all the time, and I genuinely mean it, not that I was a good lawyer, but I think it's terribly demeaning to really expert and good lawyers that the whole value is really, measured at a unit of time. It's just dumb. It's just not how the real world and other businesses operate. So, but I think it was towards the end of 2005, I went to a conference in Sydney. I heard a guy from England, the late Paul O'Byrne, who sadly passed away. He was an accountant, a two-partner firm out of London, and he talked about value pricing. And Geraldine, I had never heard of that concept, even pricing. It's not really what most law firms, at least in those days, did. And he talked about value pricing and, you know, pricing all services up front, getting rid of not just the billable hour, but timesheets in his accounting firm. And for me, it was just a aha moment, like, wow, where have you been all my life? And Paul, I followed him around for, I think, the 2 days he was in Sydney, asking him all these ignorant, well, what's, you know, at the time, questions and da-da-da. I think out of almost frustration, he said, well, you know, if you're ever in England, come and visit me. And I went back to Karen and said, I'm going to go to England and spend a couple of weeks with this guy. I've just, you know, she's going, yeah, I know you've sort of gone through a midlife crisis, John, but, you know, do you really have to go to England? But I did. So a couple of months later, and Paul not only embraced me into his family and his home, but to his accounting firm and to his clients. And I realised that, yeah, there is a different way of practicing. I know that was accounting, but, you know, it's still a professional firm. And I guess one thing led to another. I used to bring Paul out here to work with law firms.
And so that enthusiasm you're talking about, right, I can really relate to that, because once you've got that energy for something, because it strikes you as just the right thing to do, you'll learn all that you can about it, right? And then other people will also see how enthusiastic you are about it. So like Paul did with you. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, I used to think, oh, I could change the world or change the law world, but I realised pretty quickly that wasn't going to happen. But it did. It you know, excited me passionately. I got to meet some other lawyers in those days. There weren't many who were practicing that way. Reasons, you know, they left what you may call big law and that leveraging people by time by hourly rate. And yeah, so I guess, and look, I was fortunate enough to, touch wood, make a practice about it and just meet some wonderful people. And I have to say, I thought, you know, I used to, whether it was Maddox or Middleton's, used to benchmark our performance against other law firms' performance. And when I look back and think of it, how it's like Dumb and Dumber. I mean, the rest of the world was changing enormously, and just because, you know, another law firm that we thought and was probably better than us were doing these things, it must be right. But once I left the mainstream profession, and it just opened opened my eyes to what some other professionals were doing out there, far smarter, inspiring people than what I was. But you learned to them, and I guess I was fortunate, had the time and the curiosity to see, and could this apply to law?
I think in 2005, the idea that there was another model for law firms was revolutionary. I think where we've got to in the last 15 years is an acceptance that it's a problem in various perspectives. From various perspectives, it's a problem. But we just don't really know what to do about it. So when you started your consulting firm, I remember I was a senior associate in a national law firm, and I couldn't see beyond billable hours because that was my reason for being. I was billing as much as I could. And then not long after, I moved to a global law firm, and I carried on. I was climbing up the ladder furiously. And in my first year at that law firm, I billed 50% more than the standard billable target for an associate in an Australian law firm. And I still wasn't the highest billing associate in my office. And it was at that point that I got it, because of the impact it was having on my entire life and even the way I was practicing. And just holistically, right, I could see the negative effect it was having on me. And so I got it. And from then on, I began to see all of the issues everywhere. Because once you see it, billable hours is that thing. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
So I was going to touch on that well-being part, because that was how it came to me, that it was just terrible for lawyers' well-being.
And I think it is, and I won't go into all the deleterious effects of billable-hour, but as I said, a production mentality, and the whole business model means to make more money, I've got to work longer hours, real or imaginary, that sort of thing, and I think it was just silly. But how do you escape? How do you get off that treadmill? Yeah. I certainly didn't go to law school. I don't think you did, to be the best, to be the highest biller. I don't think many do, or to be the best person who could fill out timesheets. But that's what it sort of led to. And I'm being a bit facetious, but not all that much. So it really meant that we had to have both a different mindset and business model. And you're right, back in 2005, perhaps a lot of it was theory, and there was certainly interest going, wow, and I've got to say, can't remember whether it was specifically your former firm, but other firms, even large firms I went to, the feeling was, particularly if I brought the late Paul O'Byrne with me, or Ron Baker, who's my pricing mentor out here, and they go, wow, that is so, so interesting how, don't ring us, we'll ring you. And invariably they'd go back to a partners meeting, and you talk about partner, and go, well, can they guarantee us we're going to make more money? Can they get, that sort of thing? And so, there wasn't a lot of take up. And to be frank, unless you may see it differently, but in most of the firms I work with, at least the bigger firms, unless a client was really insisting on, we wanted a fixed fee or different billing or pricing model, there wasn't a lot of motivation to change. And I understand that it's hard to tell a room full of millionaires that their business model sucks, because our profession has done well out of the billable-hour
It has
model
so far, but the issue is whether it can continue to. And I think that rather than wait for the change to affect us dramatically, we need to be ahead of it.
And Geraldine, you're so right. I don't like it when they say, well, we're waiting for a client to tell us it's not acceptable. We shouldn't do that. I mean, we should have such a value proposition that a potential client says, wow, I've got to work with you people. But also, you touched upon it too. I think the wellness of those in our profession, and you saw it, and I was not naive to it, but I didn't know how to deal with it in those days. We had a lot of good people leaving the private profession. I have to say, I don't know what the statistics were, but they seemed to me they were much more women, females, leaving the profession than males. I suspect that's because they were actually making decisions with their feet, whereas some of the males, even if they hated the culture of the billable hours, it's a macho thing, we have to stick with it.
They were more likely to be the main breadwinner, and so they had less options.
But now there's so many more opportunities for those that, I wish they didn't leave the private profession, but, many of them are starting up their own firms, like you do, with a different business model, not just a pricing model, because my view is that if you move away from the billable hour and timesheets, a whole new world opens to you.
Well, I've had conversations with clients or potential clients when they want to know what my charge out rate is, and I say I don't have one, because I wouldn't even know how to set one for myself, because it's just not how I charge.
Yep.
It's all charged on value, a fixed fee, and then a conversation around it.
And I never had a chargeable rate, although I have to tell you, I won't name the firm, but, I was going in to help them moving away or doing more fixed fees or upfront pricing, value-based pricing, and they said, what's your hourly rate? I'm going, well, no, I don't have an hourly. No, but you've got to have an hourly rate. We've got to put it in our system. I said, no,
that's it. Because it's so embedded, right? It's the metric as well as how the revenue is earned. So it's a metric of everything. It's the metric of performance. And when performance is measured by by how many hours you record. That is actually what ties back into the well-being. And I can say that from personal experience. When you begin to feel like you can't even get up and take a break, go have a coffee, leave early because you're absolutely wrecked from the big night before working at your desk on a deal, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
But I think when you think about it, it's not what clients even buy from law firms. You know, they really don't buy time. And, you know, I say to some of the firms I work with, you don't believe me when we finish this conversation, ring up your best client, ask them what they buy from you. I guarantee it is not time. I mean, they buy things like outputs and outcomes and results, and yet
certainty.
and we focus everything on inputs and activities and time, which really is and should be quite irrelevant to clients. I mean, if a client, you know, is at all worried about time, it's usually elapsed time or turnaround time. You know, are you going to get me this when you promised it, John, or what have you? No, not yet. We make it about the time being spent on something.
So I think there is a realization that I touched upon earlier that the billable hour model is responsible for a lot of problems that we're seeing within the profession and within law firms. So if we know this, if you're talking to leadership at a law firm and they say we are converted, we're going to move over, how do you do it? What's the model that they move over to?
Yeah, look, that's a fair question. So it's there are different, whether it's upfront pricing or what have you, value-based pricing, which I love, which was really, agreeing. Firstly, you've got to agree on value with your client that, I'm going to deliver or hopefully deliver value. To do that, I have to have what I call, Geraldine, a value conversation with you. Forget about the actual work. So I've got to sit down with you, get to know you, find out, what you value, what's important to you, what are your needs and those sorts of things. And then hopefully we can agree, I call it a scope of value, but a scope of value, scope of work. Then we can agree on the price or prices for that scope of work. And, and again, that's based on, outcomes and outputs, and then, go and do the work. Now, if the scope materially changes, not if I spend an extra 6 minutes on the phone with you, the price may change, but at all times it's about agreeing, and some of my clients, use the word agreed pricing because it's about agreeing these things, agreeing on the scope with your client, agreeing on the price. And again, if it's going to change, I sit down with you and say, look, because we can't foretell everything that's going to happen in a matter. I know that. So things will change. But I think it's a lot that having that predictability, the certainty for clients and for the law firm. I mean, one of the greatest advantages for many of the firms that I've worked with is, maybe they can get higher prices, maybe they can't, but their cash flow, when you and I, agree a price up front, clients just pay quicker. If we've agreed that it's going to be $5,000 and you're going to pay this by next week or whatever, unless I haven't done the work or delivered the value, people pay it. Whereas in, the billable hour, as you wait till the end of the month and then you're going to whatever bill it, and then you hope, we call it duck and hope, hope that the client sees that when they get the bill that they see value in it. It's a silly business model.
That's money in itself. So
and not having cost disputes with clients.
Which takes up management time, partner time.
Yeah, so I guess it's all that. But I think more so just internally, and I know it's hard until you've experienced, but it just generates a different internal culture that's much more collaborative, much more team-based environment, a flatter structure. That's less cost to the firm because they don't have what I call the feeding the animal cost of the billable hour thing. And so it just does engender. I know, look, maybe it's not for everyone, but I have to say, after doing this for 15 years, and maybe I'm just lucky, but many of the lawyers I spoke to, they love working in a timeless environment. And I think if you love working in your environment, it transfers over to your clients too. They get it and get enthusiastic.
Exactly, because then it's truly relationship based and not transactional. Because you've got to have all of those conversations up front about value and what are your needs, etc. What's really interesting is...
sorry, I was going to say, when you asked about the first step is, and I particularly in the bigger firms, you've got to take small steps. I know that, big firm isn't going to get rid of their timesheets or the billable hours next Monday or what have you. So it's about taking a whole lot of small steps. For some firms, they do pilot programs. For some firms, they may experiment, pricing up front with particular clients or sometimes with new clients. But I have to say, usually it's because someone internally gets it. Now, it mightn't be the whole partnership, but there may be a partner who ends up commercial or property or shock horror, even litigation. And, usually when they get it, it's much easier to get it inbuilt into the firm, and starts like that.
So then if you're removing billable hour as a basis for billing clients, are you also removing it as a basis for rewarding lawyers?
Yeah, great question, because that is one of the hardest things. With the best will in the world, if, say, we're going to do fixed fees or value-based pricing, and yet you're still rewarding me by time spent or whatever.
Yeah,
it just
that's the shadow billable hour model, really.
And Geraldine, that doesn't mean we take away. The firms that I work with still have, financial goals, sometimes not for individuals though, sometimes say for a team. We know, law firms are fantastic. They know almost to the decimal point what their costs are for the next 12 months, and, most of those costs are fixed.
Yeah.
So, okay, and we want to make whatever return to partners or margins or whatever. So it costs us $5 million to run this part of the practice. We want to generate $8 million in fees. So they do have, financial benchmarks and goals and those sorts of things. So it's not all, someone said, oh, this just sounds like it's a holiday or picnic. It's not, and it's not for everyone to actually sit down with your client and have a discussion about value and to talk to them about prices is quite frightening for a lot of lawyers, let me tell you.
I know,
scary stuff.
That's because there's so much of an overhang from when we would send a bill out to a client, and in many instances know that there was going to be a problem because we hadn't stuck to the estimate, or we knew it would be a shock. So there's stress attached to it. But when you're having those conversations up front and everything is blue sky to begin with, then the stress should be removed, and you've got far more of a
and I think also conversation. Not all clients are going to like your price. But if a client doesn't like your price, when are you better off knowing? Before you've done the work or after you've done the work? And apart from anything else, trust takes a huge hit when you, particularly if you're, and I think you mentioned it before, depends, if your firm's all about transactions, maybe it doesn't matter. But if it's, which most of the firms saying, deep and meaningful relationships, sustainable relationships, then I think, and it's not just one fixed fee, work phased or stage pricing, milestones fee. The subscription model is gaining traction everywhere in the world, so it's no surprise that it's coming to law firms. Success fees, even contingency fees for non-litigation matters. So there's a whole range of what I call upfront pricing, and pricing's what you do before the work is done. Billing is what you do after the work is done. So there's a big difference when people talk about
Have you found that there's an element of educating clients? So, for example, if you were a law firm about to submit to a panel with a large client, and they ask for your charge out rates because they're going to do the beauty parade comparison, what then?
Yeah, and that's another good question, and I think it's fair to say that at least to date, with a couple of notable exceptions, most of the firms that have adopted, fixed fees or upfront pricing have had more success with their clients who, I hate to say this, but are not lawyers. They're the economic buyer or their private clients or their business people or what have you. And I know in-house counsel don't like me saying this, but there is still this resistance. It is changing, but at the big end of town, they may complain about the hourly rate or the bill shock or whatever, but they are still more accepting of the hourly rate than what I wish they were. But I can understand that. It's
you've grown up with it.
They've grown up with it. We taught them, to be frank, lawyers buying and selling from each other is often not a great recipe for innovation or taking risks or what have you. And look, sometimes in-house counsel themselves are not actually the economic buyer, or they're seen as a cost centre, unfortunately, in their own organisation. So that, but yeah, so it is, and then you've got procurement that comes in and says, and I've had that experience, and I've worked on both sides of the fence. We've got to see their hourly rates because it's a beauty parade. I think it's, and to give, there's firms out there, and I give them courage. They just say, no, we, like you said, don't have an hourly rate, but we will always agree to price whatever we do with you up front. And if you don't like the price, have a discussion with us. Or if we haven't created the value we agreed that we mutually agreed we'd create, we'll discuss the price.
Yeah, it's starting somewhere, isn't it? If it's not going to come from large in-house legal departments, then it actually does mean law firms being brave about it. It will pay off ultimately, because the change, the shift must come. So I was going to ask you, when you made that shift from third generation lawyer, partner, managing partner, chief executive, done it all, and you talked a little bit about this, but what do you think it was in you and your personality that meant you went, I'm going to do it differently?
It wasn't until I got into law school that I actually thought I'd even be a lawyer, Geraldine, even though I was the oldest of four boys. I wasn't the one who had his heart set on joining his father, and before that, grandfather in law. Mm. So that was a surprise to everyone, including my father. But I really enjoyed it. I'm not saying I didn't enjoy my clients, but I enjoyed, sometimes maybe too much, I enjoyed the management and leadership side of it much, much more. So I probably, and I was never I was never a black letter lawyer. It's one thing as you moved up to employ people like you who are much better black letter lawyers than what I ever was. But I just think it gave me much greater personal satisfaction in doing these other things. And I think if it gave me, and I was happier, that could translate much easier into my, friends and colleagues and clients. And look, it's an ongoing journey. I don't know and I'm, curious. I'm doing a lot of research and work in the subscription-based model, but there are other things. I think the whole, I don't want to see, I used to get this, not so much now, but all the time, you're trying to, destroy the legal profession or make us lose money, or that's not what I want to do. I don't, but I think it wasn't clients that introduced the billable hour on the lawyers. The lawyers, we introduced it to our clients. So therefore we can give us and take us away. And I think there are just better ways of practicing our craft. And I think if we want to be serious about still being a profession that is trusted, and I think we've lost a lot of that trust. You only have to look at some of those ethical surveys and that done. And, lawyers are still, they're making more money, but we're still going down the totem pole in trust. Doesn't that say it's somehow we've got it
relevance
wrong?
And
relevance.
We're making ourselves irrelevant. This is an issue for us.
And so I just think, I don't think there will always be law firms. I think there will always be lawyers, but I think we probably reached the zenith of what law firms are. And even now, and perhaps we always have been, even the big law firms are much more morphing into consulting advisory firms. I think to some degree the big four have been ahead of the global law firms pack, perhaps not profitability-wise, but they're much more dealing with advisory consulting. Many of those are at the C-suite level at their corporate clients, whereas still a lot of the global law firms are with the in-house counsel side of things. And I'm optimistic enough to think at some stage there'll be a business model change at the big end of town, but I honestly think that will probably occur with one of the big four first before it actually happens with one of the global firms. But I could be wrong about that.
So you said that you were working on these subscription-based models. So I was actually going to ask you what you were working on, just if you wanted to share with us. But that intrigues me, so I'd love to hear about it.
So I guess the subscription model is, I guess it's the retainer model on speed to some degree. So, but it's quite a bit wider in its. I mean, we subscribe to everything, the tech stuff you've got. Presumably, you'll buy some things, but you probably subscribe a lot to that. It's not a lot we buy these days. We subscribe to everything or a lot of things, and having almost a membership model, which is another way of looking at a subscription model. So you're a member. You come into my firm as a member, legally a client. I understand that, and we'll agree that whatever legal problem or whatever it is for the next 12 months or whatever, we will deal with that, and this is the price. And it may be, you pay a monthly subscription model. Sometimes it may be limited, that it'll only be in employment law, or it may only be but more and more I'm seeing some firms saying, we've got a subscription. It's almost akin to buying insurance. It's like we all pay for insurance, whether it's car or house or whatever. Hope to hell we don't have to make a claim, but we know that it's there. I can't get a refund on my premium if I haven't made a claim. And with a subscription model, it's not based around time or whatever. And some of my clients are on a subscription model now. I won't hear from them, sometimes for a couple of months, but under whatever terms I have with them, when they do have something I need, that I have to drop everything and deal with it. And
we've become accustomed to it, like you said, in other things that we consume. So in a Netflix world, everything is on demand. So this is what it is. Even when you compare it to the insurance model, it's that on demand. When
it is on demand,
it's there.
Yep. And I think, and you're right, Netflix or any of those others, if they have an improvement or add a new film or new movie or whatever, I then don't pay any more. I'm paying that subscription model because part of it is I'm going to get these other advantages when they do add a new movie or what have you. Whereas in the old days, we used to buy movies or buy things from Blockbuster,
and it creates the community as well, which is what I'm seeing, and having gone out on my own and building my own client base. It's also about interactions between not just me and one client, but then introducing them to another client. And so that subscription membership-based idea means you grow a community, which I think is really exciting.
And it's not. I think it's deeper value with your clients too, or with your members. And you're right. You can. I mean, some of those organisations that do it, they get their members together and they feed off each other, and it does develop that community. And I just think, again, it's that certainty of that subscription model in the fee that's being paid. They know what it is. And also, I'm a great believer in options. So some of them have, we have this subscription model for this, or you get this and you pay Y, or you get this and it's a bit lesser and you pay a bit less, those sorts of things. And
tiered membership, which is meeting the market, because we're all there in our mindset. especially after COVID, we've become so used to actually sitting in one place and then reaching out over the internet and acquiring what we need that way. And I think that mindset means we've shifted towards this whole idea of being members of whatever it is that we consume.
And I think even under the value pricing model, I'm all, and I do the same thing to my client, you know, give them options. And there's this thing about 3 options, they call it the Goldilocks effects. But when you have an option and here's the benefits you receive for the price you pay, and that's, you know, the top option, then there's a lesser one and there's a lower one and all this different, you know, it's true. It just makes clients or potential clients think much more how they're going to work with you rather than whether they work with you.
Yeah.
We all, and if I don't give you a choice and you want to, you know, you'll go to another consultant around the corner and see what they come up with, and then you start comparing it. But if I can give you those choices, and when you and I make a choice on something, we're happier. You know, we may make the wrong choice, but that's our problem. But we're happier when we have choices available to us. So
yeah. Well, John, I think we'll wrap it up there. But I could have gone on with many more questions.
And I could have gone on and on and on. You know that. Thank you, Geraldine.
Thank you for being a guest.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.